High Court ruling declaring government's lockdown regulations unconstitutional and irrational has put a spotlight on human rights during a state of disaster. As the country attempts to stop the spread of COVID-19, which rights can be waived? Joining me now to talk about this is Human Sciences Research Council's Professor Narnia Bohler-Muller. Prof, good evening and thank you for your time tonight. When I heard that judgment as well, I must admit I haven't had the thorough time to look at all of it, but I have read some summaries of it and what it means. And key to it was that the rules and regulations were unreasonable and unjustifiable. So what is reasonable and justifiable in a time of a pandemic?
Well, that's the big question, I think, and the court case didn't answer that question, and that's why it's being appealed now and probably going to the Constitutional Court. The judge was looking at rationality in terms of government action, and he was looking at various regulations, and he mentioned the regulations, but he wasn't specific about why they were irrational under this particular circumstance that we are living. So the issue of social distancing, for example, or flattening the curve, didn't really come into the argument. His argument was far more about the fact that people were suffering as a result of the regulations. So the judge didn't challenge the lockdown, the initial state of emergency, but he challenged the regulations under levels 3 and 4. Interestingly, level 4 is already passed, so that would be a retrospective judgment, and that was also quite surprising. So the judgment was vague, and it hasn't answered the questions that need to be answered, and I'm hoping that the Constitutional Court will give us a clear and concise picture of what we can and cannot expect under a lockdown and during this pandemic.
So what's the difference between a state of national disaster and a state of emergency as it relates to how it affects the Constitution or the Bill of Rights?
Right. A state of emergency is far more invasive of human rights. It's usually a situation where there is a war involved or something along those lines. And we had states of emergency under apartheid. So we haven't had a state of emergency since then, but I don't think the legislation has changed much. So, for example, it would be normal to have a curfew under a state of emergency. And that's one of the reasons why people were not happy with the regulations, because one wouldn't have a curfew when there is a natural disaster. The act was actually written, the Natural Disaster Management Act, was actually written more along the lines of an environmental disaster. I don't think it was really written in terms of this pandemic. I mean, who could actually see this coming? Nobody could see this coming. And so the regulations are very much about what one would do under those circumstances if we had a hurricane or floods. But here we have something completely different. And human rights are not abraded or abrogated during a state of natural disaster. We keep our human rights. They remain with us and they're inherent to us, but they can be limited. In order to keep ourselves safe and others safe, certain human rights can be limited. And then the question is, when can these human rights be reasonably and justifiably limited? And reasons need to be given for that, and those reasons need to be scientifically based, evidence-based. And of course, that evidence comes from various sectors. It comes from the health sector, it comes from economists, political scientists, sociologists, and we need to make sure that every step of the way we know what we're doing. But in the state of natural disaster, we need to continuously review what we're doing so that we are not unnecessarily limiting people's rights.
So in a state of a COVID-19 pandemic that spreads fast, we've seen how other countries internationally have responded with things like a curfew, with things like a lockdown. Is it a justifiable and reasonable limitation to limit the liberty of movement?
Well, I think initially the lockdown was very justifiable, and there was no question in terms of the survey that we did with the University of Johannesburg that the majority of people did not question the lockdown. 66% of people in South Africa were in support of what was happening. And so this was the way it started, and the support for the lockdown hasn't really declined all that much across the board, but with some race groups it has. So we are looking at a situation where people are becoming less satisfied with the scenario that we are facing now, with the extension of the lockdown initially, and now with the regulations that have been released that do seem to the layperson to be nonsensical. So the tide of sentiment is shifting slightly in terms of the decisions that have been made, although they are still generally supported by the South African population. What is reasonable and justifiable needs to be explained, it needs to be debated. It is a delicate balancing act between the right to life, a right to a life that is good, in other words, where you are not starving, where you are not jobless, we are not isolated, but also keeping people alive, and the right to ensure that we protect one another. So it's not an easy question to answer. And I think that the Constitutional Court judges will really have to apply their minds when looking at this, because I don't think that Judge De Beer in the High Court case applied his mind sufficiently.
Would you say the real issue might not have been the lockdown, but could have been how long it extended? It extended beyond what people felt, especially those who took this to court, was necessary.
Yes, I do think that that was one of the major issues, was that people felt that it was continuing for too long. And then there was the spat with the Ministerial Advisory Committee, where scientists were even saying, we're not sure about the extension of the lockdown. Professor Karim was saying we can go to lockdown level 1 now, and government is saying, no, we must remain cautious. So government was initially saying we're listening to the scientists, so people are saying now, well, please listen to the scientists and stop this. We know what we're facing. I think South Africans are very well aware of what we're facing. Just got the numbers in now, over 40,000, just under 41,000 infections and 848 deaths. This is just going to keep going up. But our health system needs to be able to deal with it. And so maybe we need a little bit more time. And that's something that the Minister of Health is going to have to tell us. He's going to have to stand up in front of the nation and say, look, we don't have enough beds, we don't have enough ventilators, we don't have enough medication. So we have to make sure that there are some regulations put in place to prevent people from moving around and to ensure social distancing.
What's the consequence then of this judgment? I mean, as far as society is concerned, is society now going to lose trust and confidence in the government of the day, in whatever effort that they're going to take going forward? As you mentioned, I mean, 3,267 new cases, shooting the number right over 40,000. And many would say this was expected to happen, but government is saying this is what we have been trying to avoid.
Yes. Well, we did flatten the curve, and we did give government an opportunity to set up the field hospitals and to make sure that there were more beds and more ventilators and more masks and more PPE. And we can't blame government for what the virus is doing. This is what the virus has done everywhere in the world. It has this incredible peak after the plateau, and we are seeing this. And people are going to feel afraid, and they're going to want to blame just about anybody. And of course, the Minister of Health and the other ministers are going to be in the firing line because they'll be regulating what is happening now. But I can tell you that the popularity of the president, faith in the president, is very high. And it has been so since the beginning of the lockdown at over 80%. So as long as President Ramaphosa retains the trust of the nation, people will think about ensuring that they follow the rules and regulations to keep themselves and others safe. However, if this trust is eroded too much, then it may lead to a kind of civil disobedience where people feel that, well, this doesn't make sense to me, so I'm not going to do it. And we're seeing this in some places where people are not wearing masks in public. And we're also hearing different stories and fake news about the use of masks. So it's going to be an incredibly difficult time, not only for government, but for the people of this country, and the way that we're going to have to be facing going back to work, our children going back to school, and simultaneously more and more people dying from this virus.
How important is emphasis on participation, right, as a principle when it comes to human rights, and how those who will be most affected by whatever regulation is put in place participate to an extent towards the formulation of that regulation?
It's essential. Human rights can only be upheld if citizens defend them and ensure that they are upheld. But courts are the final resort. That's something that I did want to say. One doesn't run to the court automatically. I mean, there are many, many ways of dealing with human rights and human rights violations in terms of the Chapter 9 institutions, for example, South African Human Rights Commission. We have Parliament who has oversight over the executive, and Parliament is quite quiet. But that's one of the ways in which people can voice their concerns through members of Parliament, through their constituencies. So public participation is essential to build trust and to ensure some form of social compact. So if you silence voices, it's not going to help. And it's not going to ensure that we are able and capable of looking after ourselves. Even dissenting voices need to be listened to, but I think people should also speak responsibly in public, because we need to ensure that we don't start a panic around this issue. We need to think about it in a reasonable and rational way, and we need to consider each and every one of our rights and which ones we do need to let go of for a little while in order to ensure that we do not have a bloodbath in this country.
Prof. Muller, we appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us tonight, and we do appreciate your insight. Well, there you are, human rights in a time of a pandemic and what it means to be in a state of a national disaster.